The masquerade had been unraveling for the past hour, and Victoria Thorne was running out of time. She pressed herself against a marble column in the grand ballroom beneath the opera house, watching as vampires in silk and velvet began their slow departure toward the eastern tunnels. Dawn was perhaps 90 minutes away, maybe less. The forged invitation tucked in her beaded clutch had gotten her past the guards at midnight, but every moment she remained increased the chance someone would notice she didn't belong. Her pulse hammered against her throat. She was a historian, not a spy, but the centennial masquerade happened only once every 100 years, and the archives she'd spent 5 years studying had all pointed here, to this court, to the legend of the Mourning King. The ballroom stretched 3 stories high, carved entirely from white stone that glowed under thousands of candles. Chandeliers dripping with crystals caught the light and threw it back in patterns that looked like falling stars. Vampires moved through the space with that particular grace that marked them as predators, their masks glittering, their skin pale as fresh snow. She'd worn a deep burgundy gown and a gold half-mask, hoping to blend in. Her brown hair was pinned up in an elaborate style that had taken her an hour to perfect. She looked the part. She hoped. Across the ballroom, near the dais where musicians played something slow and haunting, a figure stood alone. He wore black from head to toe, his coat cut in an older style with silver embroidery that caught the candlelight. His mask was simple, black lacquer that covered the upper half of his face, but his hair marked him immediately as vampire. White gold, falling past his shoulders, tied back loosely. His skin had that porcelain quality, luminous and cold. He wasn't dancing. He was watching the ballroom with an expression Victoria couldn't quite read. Melancholy, maybe. Or exhaustion. Something about him pulled at her. She'd spent years reading accounts of this court, piecing together fragments from old journals and letters that mortals had smuggled out over the centuries. The Mourning King had been mentioned 3 times, always in whispers, always with reverence. A vampire who had stopped dancing 100 years ago after a mortal woman died at dawn in his arms. The details were vague, the facts obscured by time and fear, but the story had haunted Victoria since she'd first read it in a water-stained diary in a Prague archive. She didn't know if the man across the room was him, but her instincts said yes. The crowd thinned further. A pair of vampires in matching silver masks glided past her, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. One of them glanced her way, and Victoria froze, but they moved on without comment. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her sides. If she was going to do this, it had to be now. Victoria crossed the ballroom with her heart in her throat, weaving between departing guests until she stood a few feet from the man in black. Up close, he was taller than she'd expected. Broad-shouldered. His hands were gloved, resting loosely at his sides. He didn't turn toward her immediately, though she knew he'd heard her approach. Vampires always did. "Forgive the intrusion," she said, keeping her voice steady, "but the musicians are still playing, and it seems a waste to let the last song go unfinished." Now he looked at her. His eyes behind the mask were pale gray, almost silver, and they studied her with an intensity that made her feel pinned in place. He didn't speak right away. Victoria forced herself not to flinch. "You're asking me to dance," he said finally. His voice was low, accented in a way that suggested centuries rather than decades. Old French, maybe, or something older still. "I am." "Why?" The question was blunt but not unkind. Victoria swallowed. "Because you look like someone who used to love dancing, and because I might never get another chance." Something flickered across his expression. Pain, maybe, or surprise. He glanced toward the eastern windows, where the sky was still black but wouldn't remain so for long. Then he looked back at her. "You're mortal." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes? You shouldn't be here." "I know. If they find out you entered on false pretenses, they'll kill you." Victoria's stomach dropped, but she kept her chin up. "Then I suppose I should make the most of the time I have left." For a long moment, he simply stared at her. Then, impossibly, his mouth curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not a smirk, something softer, sadder. "You're either very brave or very foolish. Probably both." He extended a gloved hand. "One last dance, then." She took it. His grip was firm and cold even through the leather, and when he led her onto the floor, the remaining guests seemed to part around them without conscious thought. The musicians, perhaps sensing the moment, shifted into something slower. A waltz, Victoria thought, though the melody was minor and strange. He placed his other hand at her waist and she rested hers on his shoulder. They began to move. He danced like someone who had spent lifetimes perfecting the skill, smooth, effortless, leading her through the steps with a confidence that made her feel weightless. Victoria had taken ballroom lessons in college for a semester, but this was nothing like that. This was something older, something that belonged to candlelit courts and gilded ages long past. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Victoria Thorne." "And you came here to research a legend?" She blinked. "How did you— You're carrying a notebook in your bag. I can smell the ink. And you've been watching the room like a scholar, not a guest." He turned her smoothly, and the hem of her gown swirled around her ankles. "You're not here for politics or blood contracts. You're here because you're curious." "I'm a historian," she admitted. "I study vampire courts, their structures, their laws, their stories. I've been trying to piece together the truth about this court for years." "And what truth did you come here to find?" She hesitated, but if she was already marked for execution, there was no point in lying. "The Mourning King, the vampire who stopped dancing a century ago because—" She stopped herself. "Because a mortal woman died in his arms at dawn," he finished softly. His eyes held hers. "You came here to find out if the story was real." "Yes, it is." The admission hit her like a fist to the chest. She stumbled slightly, and his hand tightened at her waist, steadying her. "You're him," she whispered. "You're the Mourning King." "I don't use that title," he said. "My name is Isandre Corveau. And yes, I am the one your legends talk about." Victoria's mind raced. She was dancing with the subject of her research, the vampire who had haunted her thoughts for years, and he was real, solid, flesh and bone and ancient grief. "What was her name?" she asked. "The woman who died." "Celeste." His voice went rougher on the name. "She was a musician. She played violin in this very ballroom during the last centennial masquerade. I asked her to stay for one more dance, and she did. But dawn came too quickly. The exits were on the eastern side then, and the sun caught her before she reached safety. She burned in front of me while I stood in the shadows, unable to help her." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm so sorry. It was my fault. I knew the risk. I asked her anyway because I was selfish." He turned her again and the candlelight blurred around them. "I haven't danced at this masquerade since. Until tonight." "Why now?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you asked me to, and because you weren't afraid." "I'm terrified," Victoria admitted. "Not of me." His thumb brushed against her waist, a gesture so small and human it made her breath catch. "You're afraid of the court, of the consequences, of dying before you finish your work. But you're not afraid of what I am." He was right. She'd spent so long studying vampires, reading their words and tracing their histories, that they'd stopped being monsters in her mind. They were people, complicated, flawed, immortal people. And Isandre Corveau, Vampire King, felt less like a predator, and more like someone carrying a wound that had never healed. "I don't think you're something to be afraid of," she said quietly. "I think you're someone who loved deeply and lost terribly, and you've been punishing yourself for it ever since." His step faltered, just for a heartbeat. Then he recovered, but his eyes never left hers. "You see too much, Victoria Thorne. It's my job." The music swelled, and he spun her out and back in with a flourish that made her gasp and laugh, despite everything. When she came back to him, his hand settled more firmly at her waist, and the distance between them shrank. She could feel the coldness radiating off him, the unnatural chill of a body that no longer generated its own heat. But beneath that, she felt something else. Presence, awareness, something that might have been longing. "They're going to find out about the forged invitation," he said. "My court has laws, ancient ones. If a mortal enters without permission, without a blood sponsor, the penalty is execution." Victoria's stomach twisted. "I know. There's a way to save you. I can claim you, make you part of my household. It would bind you to me, but it would protect you under court law. And if you don't claim me? Then you'll be brought before the council at sunset tomorrow, and they'll pass judgment, which will be death. The words hung between them, heavy as stone. Victoria's mind spun. She'd known the risk when she forged the invitation, but facing the reality of it was something else entirely. Why would you claim me? You don't know me. I know enough. His voice was firm. I know you're brave enough to walk into a vampire court alone. I know you value knowledge over safety. And I know that when you asked me to dance, you saw me as a person, not a monster or a king. That's more than most have done in centuries. You're doing this because I remind you of her, Victoria said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Isandre's jaw tightened. Perhaps I'm doing this because I've spent 100 years trying to atone for what happened, and this is the first chance I've had to actually save someone. The music was slowing. Around them, the ballroom had nearly emptied. Only a handful of vampires remained, and they were watching now, watching the king dance with a stranger. Victoria could feel the weight of their stares. If I accept your claim, she said carefully, what does that mean? For me? For my work? It means you live, Isandre said. It means you'll be under my protection. You'll have access to the court, to our archives, to histories that no mortal historian has ever seen. You'll be able to finish your research. And what do you get out of it? His expression softened. The chance to rewrite an old story, to prove that a mortal and a vampire can exist in the same world without tragedy. Victoria's heart was racing. The logical part of her brain screamed that this was insane, that she should run, that accepting a blood claim from a vampire king was a line she couldn't uncross. But the rest of her, the part that had spent years chasing this exact moment, knew she wasn't going to refuse. Yes, she said. I accept. Isandre's eyes flashed with something that might have been relief. Then we seal it now before the council notices. He stopped dancing and drew her toward the edge of the ballroom, into a shadowed alcove lined with velvet curtains. The remaining guests pretended not to watch, but Victoria felt their attention like a physical thing. Isandre pulled off one glove and extended his bare hand. His skin was impossibly pale, the veins beneath barely visible. Give me your hand, he said. Victoria held out her right hand and he took it gently. Then, with a speed that made her gasp, he pricked his own palm with a fang and did the same to hers. Blood welled up, dark red against pale skin. He pressed their palms together and Victoria felt a jolt run through her, sharp and electric. Bairishal. By blood and bone, I claim Victoria Thorne as mine, Isandre said, his voice carrying a weight that resonated in her chest. She is under my protection, bound to my house, and any who harm her answer to me. The words felt ancient, binding. Victoria's hand burned where their blood mingled. For a moment she thought she felt something else, a thread, thin and silver, stretching between them. Then it faded, and Isandre released her hand. The cut on her palm was already closing, knitting together with unnatural speed. It's done, he said quietly. You're safe now. Victoria flexed her fingers, staring at the faint scar that remained. What just happened? A blood claim. It ties your life to mine. As long as I live, you're protected by my authority, and as long as you live, I'm responsible for your actions. He pulled his glove back on. It's not a light bond, but it's the only way to keep the council from challenging your presence here. Thank you, Victoria said, and meant it. Isandre inclined his head. Come, dawn is close, and I need to get you somewhere safe before the sun rises. He led her out of the ballroom, through a side door that opened onto a long corridor lit by electric sconces designed to look like torches. The stone walls were carved with intricate patterns, and the floor was polished black marble. They passed several other vampires, all of whom bowed their heads when they saw Isandre. He didn't acknowledge them. He just kept walking, his hand resting lightly at the small of Victoria's back. They descended a staircase that spiraled down into the earth, and the temperature dropped with each step. Eventually, they emerged into a massive underground hall. It was lined with doors on both sides, each one marked with a silver plaque. Isandre stopped in front of one near the end and pushed it open. The room beyond was beautiful. High ceilings, a 4-poster bed draped in dark blue silk, a desk stacked with books, and a window that looked out onto what appeared to be an underground garden lit by bioluminescent plants. It was surreal and elegant, like something out of a dream. "This is a guest suite," Isandra said. "You'll stay here for now. It's shielded from sunlight, and the door locks from the inside. You'll be safe." Victoria stepped inside, taking it all in. "This is incredible. The court was built in the 1600s, but we've modernized over the centuries. We're not savages." There was a hint of dry humor in his voice. "There's clothing in the wardrobe, and food will be brought to you at sunset. If you need anything, pull the cord by the door, and a servant will come." "And you?" Victoria asked, turning to face him. "Where will you be?" "In my own chambers. I don't sleep much, but I'll be unavailable until the sun sets. The claim will be announced to the council tonight, and there will be questions. You'll need to be prepared." "What kind of questions?" "Why you came here, what you intend to do, whether you pose a threat to the court." His gray eyes held hers. "I'll shield you as much as I can, but you'll need to speak for yourself. Be honest. The council respects honesty, even from mortals." Victoria nodded, her mind already racing with everything she'd need to say. "I can do that." "I believe you can." Isandra lingered in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You asked me earlier why I stopped dancing. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that if I danced again, I'd remember what it felt like to want something I couldn't keep, to love something that would slip through my fingers." "And now?" Victoria asked softly. "Now I'm still afraid, but I'm also tired of letting fear decide what I do." He stepped back into the hallway. "Rest, Victoria Thorne. We'll speak again at sunset." The door closed behind him, and Victoria was alone. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her mind spinning. She'd come here to research a legend, and now she was living inside one, bound to a vampire king, protected by a blood claim. It was everything she'd spent years working toward, and nothing she'd expected. She thought about Celeste, the mortal woman who had died at dawn, about the grief that had carved itself into Isandra's face when he spoke her name, about the way he'd danced with Victoria like he was trying to hold on to something fragile and fleeting. And she thought about the silver thread she'd felt when their blood touched, the strange, undeniable pull that had settled in her chest the moment she'd seen him standing alone in the ballroom. Victoria didn't believe in fate, but she believed in stories. And this one, she realized, was just beginning. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, too wired to sleep but too exhausted to think clearly. Outside the window, the bioluminescent garden glowed softly in shades of blue and green. It was beautiful, unreal. She closed her eyes and let herself drift. When she woke, it was to the sound of someone knocking. Victoria sat up, disoriented. The room was still dim, the garden outside still glowing. She had no idea how long she'd slept. "Come in," she called. The door opened and a vampire entered, female, pale-skinned with white hair cut short, dressed in a tailored suit. She carried a tray with a silver dome covering it. "I'm Isolde," she said, her voice clipped and efficient. "I serve the king's household. He asked me to bring you dinner and to inform you that the council convenes in 2 hours." "Thank you." Victoria took the tray and set it on the desk. Under the dome was bread, cheese, fruit, and a glass of red wine. Simple, but it looked fresh. "Can I ask you something?" Isolde paused by the door. "If it's quick." "How long has Isandra been king?" 400 years, give or take." Isolde's expression was unreadable. "He's the longest reigning monarch this court has had. Stable, fair, unbending when it comes to the law." "Is that why he claimed me? Because the law would have killed me otherwise?" Isolde's eyes sharpened. "The king doesn't explain his decisions to me. But I will say this, he hasn't claimed anyone in over a century. Not since Celeste. Whatever his reasons, they're significant." "Do you think the council will accept me?" "That depends on you." Isolde's gaze was steady. "If you can prove you're useful, they'll tolerate your presence. If you can't, they'll find a way to remove you, blood claim or not. Tread carefully, historian." She left before Victoria could respond. Victoria ate slowly, her stomach too tight to manage more than a few bites. She drank the wine, though, hoping it would steady her nerves. Then she changed into one of the dresses in the wardrobe, a deep green gown that fit surprisingly well, and pinned her hair back into something resembling order. By the time Isolde returned to escort her to the council chamber, Victoria felt almost ready. The chamber was smaller than the ballroom, but no less grand. It was circular, with a domed ceiling painted in gold leaf and frescoes depicting battles and coronations. A round table dominated the center, and seated around it were 7 vampires, all dressed in formal attire. Isandra sat at the head, his white hair unbound now, falling around his shoulders like a cloak. He looked every inch the king. Victoria was directed to stand at the edge of the table opposite him. The other council members watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to disdain. Thrall. This is Victoria Thorne, Isandre said, his voice calm but firm. I have claimed her under the old laws, and she is now under my protection. She is here to address any concerns the council may have. A vampire to his right spoke first. Male, with sharp features and hair pulled back in a severe knot. She entered the centennial masquerade on a forged invitation. That is grounds for execution, regardless of any claim. It would be, Isandre agreed, if the claim hadn't been made. But it has, and the law is clear. A claimed mortal cannot be executed without first appealing to their sponsor, and I do not grant that appeal. Why claim her at all? This came from a female vampire on the left, her voice cold. She's a historian, a scholar. What possible use is she to this court? Victoria took a breath and stepped forward. Because I can offer you something no one else can. I've spent 5 years compiling records of this court's history from mortal sources. Letters, journals, testimonies from mortals who served here or traded with you. I can cross-reference your internal archives with external accounts, giving you a fuller picture of how this court is seen in the mortal world, and I can help you understand how to navigate modern mortal society without exposing yourselves. The council exchanged glances. The sharp-featured vampire leaned forward. And why would we trust a mortal to handle such sensitive information? Because I've already proven I can keep secrets, Victoria said evenly. I've known about this court for years, and I've never published a word. I came here to learn, not to expose you. If I wanted to reveal your existence, I would have done it long ago. Another council member, an older vampire with a scar across his cheek, spoke. What is it you hope to gain from this arrangement? Access to your archives, Victoria said honestly, the chance to study your histories firsthand. I want to write the definitive account of vampire courts, but I want it to be accurate, respectful, not sensationalized or distorted. And if we refuse? The cold female vampire asked. Then I'll leave, Victoria said, but you'll have missed an opportunity. How many mortals do you think would walk into this court, alone and unarmed, just to ask you questions? How many would risk their lives for the truth? Silence fell. Then Isandra spoke. Victoria Thorne has shown more courage than most vampires I know. She deserves the chance to prove herself. The council deliberated in low voices for several minutes. Finally, the sharp-featured vampire nodded. Very well, she may stay, but she will be monitored. Any breach of trust, any attempt to expose this court, and the claim will be void. Are we clear? Crystal, Victoria said. Then this matter's settled. Isandre stood and the rest of the council followed suit. Victoria will have access to the lower archives under supervision. She will report her findings to me directly. This session is adjourned. The council members filed out, and Victoria let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Isandre crossed the room to her, his expression softening slightly. Well done. I thought I was going to pass out, Victoria admitted. You didn't. You stood your ground and spoke with authority. That's all they needed to see. He gestured toward the door. Come, I'll show you the archives. They walked together through the winding corridors beneath the opera house, descending even deeper into the earth. Victoria asked questions as they went, and Isandra answered them with the patience of someone who had lived long enough to value curiosity. He told her about the court's founding, about the wars that had shaped it, about the uneasy truce between vampires and mortals that had held for centuries. We're not the monsters your stories make us out to be, he said at one point, but we're not saints either. We survive, we adapt, and sometimes we fail. Like with Celeste, Victoria said quietly. Isandre's step didn't falter, but his jaw tightened. Yes, like with Celeste. They reached a massive iron door carved with symbols Victoria didn't recognize. Isandre pressed his palm against it, and it swung open silently. Beyond was a library that took Victoria's breath away. Shelves stretched up 3 stories, crammed with books and scrolls and loose parchment. Tables were covered in maps and ledgers. The air smelled like old paper and ink and time. This is the lower archive, Isandre said. Everything here is at least 200 years old. The upper archive holds more recent records, but you'll start here. Isolde will bring you what you need. Victoria walked slowly into the room, her fingers trailing over the spines of ancient books. This is incredible. It's yours to explore, within reason. Isandre's voice held a hint of amusement. Don't burn anything. I would never. He watched her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted, softened. You really do love this, don't you? The history, the stories. I do, Victoria said. It's the only thing I've ever been good at, finding the truth in old lies and piecing together what really happened. Then you'll do well here. Isandre moved toward the door. I have other matters to attend to, but Isolde will stay with you. If you need me, send word. Isandre, Victoria said, and he paused. Thank you for claiming me, for giving me this chance. He looked at her, and for a heartbeat, she saw the weight of centuries in his eyes. Thank you for asking me to dance. Then he was gone, and Victoria was alone with the archives and the ghosts of 1,000 stories waiting to be told. She spent the next several hours lost in research, pulling books and scrolls at random, her notebook filling with notes. Isolde watched from a corner, silent but present. Victoria barely noticed. She was in her element, chasing threads and connections, her mind alive in a way it hadn't been in months. But as the hours wore on, her thoughts kept circling back to Isandre, to the way he'd held her during the dance, firm and careful, like she was something precious, to the way his voice had roughened when he spoke about Celeste, to the blood claim that still tingled faintly under her skin. She didn't know what she'd gotten herself into, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The days blurred together after that. Victoria fell into a routine, waking at sunset, spending hours in the archives, taking meals in her room, occasionally crossing paths with Isandre in the corridors. They spoke in passing, brief exchanges about her research or court politics, but there was always something unspoken between them, a tension that hummed like a live wire. She learned more about him in fragments. He was patient, but not soft, fair, but unyielding when it came to the law. He carried himself with the authority of someone who had ruled for centuries, but there was a loneliness in him that Victoria recognized, a grief that had never fully healed. And she learned about the court, about the delicate balance of power between the old families, about the laws that governed vampire society, some of which dated back 1,000 years, about the blood trade, the rituals, the hierarchy. It was fascinating and complex, and Victoria documented everything with meticulous care. But she also learned about the dangers, about the factions within the court who resented her presence, about the whispers that followed her through the halls. She was mortal, fragile, a liability. Isolde, who had warmed to her slightly over the weeks, warned her one evening. You're making enemies whether you realize it or not. The old guard doesn't like change, and you represent change. What should I do? Victoria asked. Stay close to the king, and don't wander alone after midnight. That's when the court is most active, and not everyone respects the blood claim. Victoria took the warning seriously. She stayed in well-lit corridors, avoided isolated areas, and made sure Isolde or another trusted servant was always nearby. But she refused to hide. She had work to do, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her. One night, about 3 weeks after the masquerade, Isandre invited her to his private study. It was a smaller room than she'd expected, lined with books and dominated by a large desk covered in papers. A fireplace crackled in the corner, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. You've been busy, Isandre said, gesturing to the stack of notebooks Victoria had brought with her. Isolde tells me you've gone through half the lower archive already. I work fast when I'm inspired, Victoria said, settling into the chair across from him. And there's a lot to be inspired by. Your court's history is remarkable. Remarkable is one word for it. He poured 2 glasses of wine and slid one across the desk to her. Bloody is another. All histories are bloody, Victoria said. It's how we learn from them that matters. Lysandra's mouth curved into a faint smile. You're an optimist. I'm a realist, but I believe in progress. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. You're different from what I expected. What did you expect? Someone more timid, more easily frightened. He swirled his wine. Instead, you're fearless, stubborn. You argue with the council. You challenge traditions. And you don't back down when vampires twice your age try to intimidate you. Victoria felt her cheeks heat. I'm not fearless. I'm terrified half the time. But I've learned that fear doesn't have to stop you. It can just be something you carry while you do the work anyway. That's wisdom, Lysandra said quietly. Hard-earned wisdom. They fell into an easy conversation after that, talking about history and philosophy and the strange overlap between mortal and vampire cultures. Lysandre was well-read, sharp-witted, and surprisingly funny when he let his guard down. Victoria found herself laughing more than once, and each time she saw something shift in his expression, a lightness that hadn't been there before. Can I ask you something? Victoria said eventually. Of course. Why haven't you taken another partner? In the centuries since Celeste died, surely there have been others who— There haven't, Lysandra interrupted gently. I closed myself off after she died. I told myself it was to protect others, to avoid repeating the same mistake. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. It's easier not to care than to risk losing someone again. And now? Victoria asked. He met her eyes. Now I'm realizing that easier isn't the same as better. The air between them felt charged. Victoria's pulse quickened, and she saw Lysandra's gaze flicker to her throat, tracking the rhythm of her heartbeat. But he didn't move. He just watched her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. I should go, Victoria said, though she didn't want to. You should, Lysandra agreed, but neither of them moved. Finally, Victoria stood gathering her notebooks. Thank you for the wine, and the conversation. Any time? She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Victoria. Yes? Be careful. Not everyone in this court is as patient as I am. I know. She left before she could say anything else, her heart pounding. Back in her room, she paced for an hour, unable to settle. Something was building between them, something undeniable, and she didn't know what to do about it. The weeks turned into a month, then 2. Victoria's research progressed steadily. She began compiling her notes into something resembling a manuscript. She interviewed vampires who were willing to talk, cross-referenced their accounts with the archives, and slowly built a picture of the court that was more complete than anything she could have imagined. But more than that, she and Lysandra grew closer. They fell into a routine of late-night conversations in his study, where they talked about everything and nothing. He told her stories about the centuries he'd lived through, the wars and revolutions and moments of quiet beauty. She told him about her childhood, her decision to become a historian, the loneliness of dedicating her life to the past, and slowly, carefully, they stopped pretending there wasn't something more between them. It started with small things, his hand lingering on hers when he passed her a book, her fingers brushing his shoulder when she leaned over his desk to point out a passage, the way they sat closer each night, the space between them shrinking until it was almost non-existent. One evening, after a particularly long session in the archives, Victoria returned to her room to find a package waiting on her bed. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the pages blank, and a note in Lysandra's precise handwriting. For your thoughts. The ones you don't put in your research. Victoria pressed the journal to her chest, smiling. She'd never received a gift that felt so perfectly tailored to her. That night, she wrote her first entry, and it was about him. About the way he looked when he thought no one was watching. About the quiet kindness he showed to the mortals who served the court. About the way her heart skipped when he said her name. She didn't plan to show him. But somehow, she thought he already knew. The turning point came during a council session 2 months after Victoria's arrival. A dispute had arisen between 2 vampire families over territory in the mortal world, and the arguments had grown heated. Victoria was there to observe, taking notes as always, when one of the council members turned on her. "This is why mortals shouldn't be allowed in the inner court," he snarled. "They weaken us, make us second-guess our instincts." "That's enough," Isandra said, his voice cold. "No, it's not." The vampire stood, his eyes flashing. "She's a distraction, a liability. You claimed her because you're still mourning the last mortal who got herself killed, and now you're repeating the same mistake." Victoria's breath caught. The room went silent. Isandra rose slowly, and the temperature seemed to drop. "You will apologize. Now." "I will not. Someone has to say it. You're compromised, Isandra. You've been compromised since the night you danced with her, and it's going to get her killed, just like it did Celeste." Isandra moved faster than Victoria could follow. One moment he was standing at the head of the table, and the next he had the vampire pinned against the wall by the throat. "You do not speak her name," he said, his voice low and deadly, "and you do not presume to tell me how to rule my court." The vampire choked out something that might have been an apology. Isandra released him, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping. The rest of the council watched in stunned silence. "This session is over," Isandra said. "Leave, all of you." They fled, and Victoria was left alone with him. He stood with his back to her, his hands braced on the table, his breathing uneven. She approached slowly, carefully. "Isandre." "He's right," Isandra said hoarsely. "I am compromised. I have been since the night you asked me to dance." "That's not a bad thing." "It is if it gets you killed." He turned to face her, and his eyes were raw. "I can't do this again, Victoria. I can't watch someone He stopped himself. "Someone you what?" Victoria asked softly. He closed his eyes. "Someone I care about." Victoria stepped closer until she was standing directly in front of him. "Then don't watch me die. Help me live." Isandra opened his eyes, and the look in them was so vulnerable it made her chest ache. "I don't know how. You start by not pushing me away." She reached up and touched his face, her palm resting against his cool cheek. "You start by letting yourself feel this, whatever this is." For a moment, he didn't move. Then he covered her hand with his, pressing it more firmly against his face. "I'm afraid," he admitted. "So am I. What if I lose you? What if you don't?" He exhaled shakily, and then he was kissing her. His hands came up to frame her face, and his mouth was cool and careful, like he was afraid she might break. Victoria kissed him back, pouring everything she felt into it, the weeks of longing, the quiet moments, the connection that had been building between them since the first dance. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Isandra rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "This is dangerous. I know. The court will talk. Let them." He laughed softly, and the sound was so full of relief it made her smile. "You're going to be the death of me." "I thought you were already dead," Victoria teased. "Undead," he corrected. "There's a difference." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped up in each other, and for the first time since Celeste's death, Isandra allowed himself to hope. The next few weeks were both the best and the most complicated of Victoria's life. She and Isandra didn't hide their relationship, but they didn't flaunt it either. They were careful, aware of the scrutiny they were under. But in private, in his study or her room, they were just two people learning to navigate the strange, fragile thing growing between them. He was gentle with her in a way that surprised her. For someone who had ruled for centuries, who commanded an entire court with a word, he was almost tentative when it came to her, like he was afraid of making a wrong move. "I'm not made of glass," Victoria told him one night, curled up beside him on the sofa in his study. "You don't have to treat me like I'm going to shatter." "I know that," Isandra said, "but you're mortal, fragile in ways I'm not, and I've already lost someone because I was careless." "You weren't careless with Celeste," Victoria said firmly. "You asked her to stay and she chose to. That was her choice, her risk. You can't carry the guilt for that forever." "I've carried it for 100 years. I'm not sure I know how to let it go." Victoria shifted so she was facing him. "Then let me help you." He looked at her, and his expression was so full of emotion it took her breath away. "How did I find you?" "You didn't. I found you." She smiled. "I walked into a vampire court with a forged invitation and asked the Mourning King to dance. That's all on me." "Best decision I never made," Isandre murmured and kissed her. But not everything was perfect. The faction within the court that resented Victoria's presence grew bolder. There were whispered threats, veiled comments, and one night, an attempt to bar her from the archives. Isandra shut it down immediately, but the message was clear. Not everyone accepted her. "They're afraid," Isolde told her one evening. "Afraid that you're changing things, and change is dangerous when you've lived as long as we have." "I don't want to cause problems," Victoria said. "Too late for that." Isolde's tone was dry. "But for what it's worth, I think you're good for him. He's been half alive for a century. You've brought him back." Victoria didn't know what to say to that, but she felt the truth of it. Isandre was different now, lighter, more present, and she realized that she loved him, not just cared about him, but loved him deeply, terrifyingly, completely. She didn't tell him right away. She wanted to find the right moment. But one night, after a particularly tense council session, he came to her room looking exhausted. "Bad day?" she asked, pulling him inside. "Long day," he corrected. He sank onto the edge of her bed, rubbing his face. "The council is fracturing. There are too many old grudges, too many competing interests. I'm holding it together, but barely." Victoria sat beside him, taking his hand. "You're doing everything you can. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does. But you're a good king, Isandre. Fair. Just, people respect you because you've earned it." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. "How do you always know what to say?" "I don't. I just say what I feel." "And what do you feel right now?" Victoria took a breath. "That I love you, and that scares me more than anything else in this court." Isandra went very still. Then he cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "Say that again." "I love you." He kissed her, slow and deep, and when he pulled back, his voice was rough. "I love you too. I've been trying not to, but I can't help it. You've burrowed into my heart, and I don't want you to leave." "Then I won't," Victoria said simply. They made love that night, slow and careful and full of emotion, and when Victoria fell asleep in his arms, she felt safer than she ever had in her life. But safety, she would learn, was an illusion. The attack came a week later. Victoria was in the archives, deep in research, when she heard shouting. She looked up just in time to see a vampire she didn't recognize rushing toward her, fangs bared. Isolde intercepted him, and they went down in a tangle of limbs and snarls. "Run!" Isolde shouted. Victoria ran. She bolted through the corridors, her heart hammering, her mind blank with panic. She could hear footsteps behind her, fast and relentless. She turned a corner and collided with someone. She screamed, but then she realized it was Isandre. "Victoria, what—" "Someone attacked me in the archives," she gasped. Isolde stopped him, but there might be others. Isandre's expression went cold and deadly. "Stay behind me." He led her through the corridors at a speed she could barely match, his body positioned between her and any potential threat. They reached his private chambers, and he locked the door behind them, sealing it with a ward that made the air shimmer. "You're safe now," he said, turning to her. "Are you hurt?" "No." Isolde stopped him before he could touch me. Isandre pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I should have seen this coming. I should have protected you better." "You can't be everywhere at once," Victoria said, her voice muffled against his chest. "And I'm fine. Isolde saved me. I'll make sure she's rewarded." Isandra pulled back, his hands on her shoulders. "But this can't continue. You're a target now. They're using you to get to me." "Then we deal with it," Victoria said. "Together." He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Resolve, maybe, or determination. "You're right. We deal with it, but not the way they expect." "What do you mean?" "The problem is the law. The old law that says mortals who enter the court uninvited must be executed unless claimed. It's that law that makes you vulnerable. If I change it, remove the threat, they'll have no grounds to come after you." Victoria's eyes widened. "You're going to change a law that's been in place for centuries?" "Yes. The council will never agree to that." "They don't have to." Isandre's voice was firm. "I'm the king. I have the authority to amend court law if it serves the greater good, and this does. But it's going to cause an uproar." "Let it," he cupped her face. "I've spent 100 years letting fear dictate my choices. I'm done with that. I'm not going to let history repeat itself." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. "You're doing this for me." I'm doing this for us and for every mortal who might come after you. The old ways need to change, Victoria. And it starts now." He called an emergency council session that night. Victoria stood at his side as he addressed the assembled vampires, his voice ringing with authority. "I am amending the law regarding mortal entry into this court," Isandre announced. "Effective immediately, mortals who enter without invitation will no longer face execution. Instead, they will be detained and questioned, and their fate will be decided on a case-by-case basis. Furthermore, I am establishing a formal process for mortals to petition for entry, with clear guidelines and protections." The council erupted. Vampires shouted over each other, some in support, most in outrage, but Isandre stood firm, his expression unyielding. "This is not a debate," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is a decree. The law is changed. Any who oppose it may challenge me directly." No one did. Even the most vocal dissenters fell silent under the weight of his authority. Isandre was a vampire king, and when he spoke with the full force of his power, no one dared stand against him. "There's one more change," Isandre continued. "The eastern exits will be rebuilt and shaded. No more will mortals risk the dawn to leave this court. We will adapt our structure to accommodate them. This is not negotiable." The silence that followed was heavy. Then, slowly, the council members began to nod, some reluctantly, some with clear approval. But it was done. When the session ended, Victoria was shaking. Isandre took her hand and led her out of the chamber, away from the stairs and whispers. They walked to the underground garden, where the bioluminescent plants glowed softly in the darkness. "You just changed everything," Victoria said. "I changed what needed to be changed." Isandre turned to face her, his hands cupping her face. "I won't let fear rule me anymore. I won't let the past dictate the future. You taught me that." "I didn't teach you anything." "You did. You showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it." He kissed her forehead. "I love you, Victoria Thorne, and I'm going to spend the rest of your life proving it." Victoria's heart swelled. "I love you too." They stood together in the garden, wrapped in each other, and for the first time, the future felt open, possible, full of hope. The changes Isandre implemented didn't happen overnight. It took months to rebuild the exits, to establish the new protocols, to win over the skeptics within the court. But slowly, steadily, things shifted. Mortals began to petition for entry, and some were granted access to study, to trade, to build alliances. The court became less insular, more connected to the mortal world above. And Victoria thrived. Her research flourished, and she became a bridge between the two worlds, translating vampire culture for mortals and mortal concerns for vampires. She was respected, valued, and most importantly, safe. She and Isandre grew closer with each passing month. They talked about the future, about what it would look like to build a life together, despite the vast differences between them. It wasn't easy. There were challenges: her mortality, his responsibilities, the court's expectations. But they faced them together. One evening, nearly a year after the masquerade, Isandre took her to the ballroom. It had been restored for another event, and the chandeliers glittered just as they had that first night. "I have something to ask you," he said, his tone serious. Victoria's heart fluttered. "What is it?" "The next centennial masquerade is 99 years away, but I don't want to wait that long to dance with you again." He held out his hand. "Will you dance with me, Victoria? Not because dawn is coming or because it's the last chance we'll have, but just because I want to hold you close." Victoria felt tears sting her eyes. She took his hand. "Yes." They danced in the empty ballroom, just the two of them, moving to music only they could hear. And as they turned in slow circles under the chandeliers, Victoria realized something. This was what happiness felt like, not the absence of fear or pain, but the presence of love, deep, steady, unshakable love. "I want to spend my life with you," Isandre murmured against her hair, "however long that life is." "Then we will," Victoria said. "We'll make it work, together." And they did. Years passed, and Victoria continued her work, eventually publishing a groundbreaking account of vampire courts that changed the way mortals understood the undead. It was respectful, nuanced, and meticulously researched, and it opened doors for further collaboration between the two worlds. She and Isandra became partners in every sense of the word. He ruled the court with wisdom and fairness, and she stood beside him, advising, challenging, supporting. They were a team, and the court flourished under their combined leadership. And when the time came, when Victoria began to think about the future in more concrete terms, they talked about family, about what it would mean to bring a child into their world. It was complicated. Mortal children born to mixed unions were rare, and there were risks. But they wanted it. Both of them. Leandra was born on a cool autumn night, and he was perfect. Dark-haired like his mother, with his father's gray eyes and a spirit that was entirely his own. Isandra held him with a reverence that made Victoria's heart ache, and she knew in that moment that everything they'd fought for, every risk they'd taken, had been worth it. They raised Leandra in the court, surrounded by both mortals and vampires, teaching him to navigate both worlds. He grew up strong and curious, with his mother's love of learning and his father's sense of justice. And he was loved, fiercely, protectively, completely. On the night of Leandra's 5th birthday, the court held a celebration. The ballroom was filled with guests, both mortal and vampire, and the atmosphere was joyous. Isandra stood at the edge of the room, watching his family with an expression of quiet contentment. Victoria joined him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking?" "That I never thought I'd have this," Isandra said. "A family, a future, happiness." "You deserve it," Victoria said softly. "You've always deserved it." He turned to her, his eyes full of emotion. "I wouldn't have any of it without you." "We found it together," Victoria corrected, "and we'll keep it together." Isandra kissed her, slow and tender, and around them the court celebrated. The ballroom was full of light and laughter, a far cry from the lonely, grief-stricken place it had been a century ago. The Mourning King was no longer mourning. He was living, loving, thriving. And it all started with a single dance. As the night wore on and the celebration continued, Victoria found herself standing at the edge of the ballroom, watching Isandra dance with their son. Leandra's laughter rang out, bright and clear, and Isandra's smile was so full of joy it took her breath away. She thought about that first masquerade, about the forged invitation and the desperate gamble that had brought her here, about the vampire king who had held her close as dawn threatened the sky, and the choice he'd made to let love in instead of pushing it away. And she thought about the future, about the years they'd have together, the challenges they'd face, the love that would carry them through. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real, messy and complicated and full of obstacles, but also full of hope and beauty and the kind of love that changed everything. Victoria smiled as Isandra caught her eye across the room and winked. Then she crossed the ballroom to join her family, and together they danced into the night. Decades passed, and Victoria's mortal life eventually reached its natural end. But she lived it fully, surrounded by love, and when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, it was with Isandra holding her hand and Leandra at her side. Isandra mourned her, as he knew he would. But this time, it was different. This time, he didn't let the grief consume him. He honored her memory by continuing the work they'd started together, by raising their son to be strong and kind, by ensuring that the court remained a place where mortals and vampires could coexist. And on the night of the next centennial masquerade, 100 years after the night he had danced with Victoria, Isandra stood in the ballroom and told her story. He told it to the assembled court, to the mortals and vampires who had gathered to celebrate, and he told it with pride. She whispered, "One last dance," he said, his voice carrying through the room, and I held her close as first light threatened the sky. But instead of letting fear dictate what happened next, we chose love. We chose to change the rules, to build something new, to believe that a mortal and a vampire could have a future together. And we did. We had a beautiful, complicated, wonderful life, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat. The ballroom erupted in applause, and Isandra smiled. It was bittersweet, full of memory and loss, but also full of gratitude. He'd loved Victoria Thorne with everything he had, and she'd loved him back. And that love had changed not just him, but the entire court. Leandra, now a young man, joined his father on the dais. "To my mother," he said, raising a glass, "who walked into a vampire court with nothing but courage and curiosity, and who showed us all that love is stronger than fear." "To Victoria," the court echoed, and the ballroom filled with light and music and the sound of celebration. And somewhere, in the space between memory and eternity, Victoria smiled, because her story wasn't a tragedy. It was a triumph, and it would be told for centuries to come. The masquerade continued long into the night, and as dawn approached, the guests began to leave through the shaded exits Isandra had built all those years ago. No one feared the sun anymore. No one had to choose between staying and safety. Isandra stood in the ballroom as it emptied, remembering the way Victoria had looked in her burgundy gown, the way her hand had felt in his, the way she'd smiled at him with no fear, only curiosity and warmth. "I miss you," he whispered to the empty room, "but I'm grateful for every moment, for every dance." And as the first light of dawn broke over the city above, filtering down through the shaded passages and into the underground court, Isandra felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. The story of the Mourning King and the mortal historian became legend. It was told and retold, passed down through generations, and it changed the way people saw vampires. Not as monsters, but as people capable of love and growth and change. And in the court beneath the opera house, in the archives where Victoria had spent so many hours, her work lived on. Her books lined the shelves, her notes filled countless volumes, and her legacy shaped the future of vampire-mortal relations for centuries to come. Leandra grew into a leader in his own right, carrying forward his parents' vision of a world where mortals and vampires could coexist peacefully. He had his mother's intellect and his father's strength, and he used both to build bridges where walls had once stood. And Isandra, the vampire king who had once been defined by loss, was now defined by love. He ruled with wisdom and compassion, and though he missed Victoria every day, he knew she would be proud of what they'd built together. On quiet nights, he would return to the ballroom and remember the masquerade, remember the dance, remember the way she'd looked at him and seen not a monster or a king, but a person, someone worth knowing, someone worth loving. And he would whisper into the darkness, "Thank you for asking me to dance, for showing me that it's possible to let go of the past without forgetting it, for giving me a reason to believe in the future again." The ballroom never answered, but Isandra didn't need it to. He carried Victoria with him always, in his heart and in his memories. And that was enough. Years turned into decades, and decades turned into centuries, and the court continued to thrive. Mortals and vampires worked side by side, building a society that honored both their differences and their shared humanity. And at the center of it all was the story of a mortal historian and a vampire king who had dared to love each other despite every obstacle. It was a story of courage and hope and the transformative power of love. A story that proved that even in the darkest places, light could find a way in. A story that would be told for as long as the court stood. And it all began with a single dance, a whispered request, a vampire king who chose to hold her close as first light threatened the sky and then chose to change the world so the dawn would never be a threat again. That was the story. That was the legacy. And it would endure forever.